Seattle, in late November, was a city soaked in gray. The rain didn't fall in torrents, but lingered, misting the skyline, softening the edges of buildings, and washing the world in a dull silver hue. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Monroe penthouse, Caleb watched the lights flicker across the water like stars struggling to stay lit. The apartment behind him was immaculate and cold, designed more for photographs than living. The air smelled faintly of oak and absence. Caleb stood with a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, the ice already melted. He hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes. His father's words replayed in his head, dull and sharp at the same time. "You will marry Eleanor Reed." Not a question, not even a warning, just a statement. He'd laughed at first, a short, bitter sound that died quickly. "That's not how this works anymore," he had said, looking across the wide oak desk in the Monroe boardroom. His father hadn't blinked. "It's exactly how this works. This family has built its name on legacy, not on emotion." Caleb had sat back in the chair, rubbing his thumb across the edge of the armrest. "You expect me to marry someone I've never met? For business? I expect you to honor the role you were born into. The Reeds have been loyal investors for decades. Their daughter is quiet, well-mannered, and not interested in public spectacle. This is the kind of union that protects what we've built." His mother, seated beside his father, had added in her softer tone, "We're not asking you to love her. We're asking you to respect the partnership. That's all this is." Caleb had wanted to shout, to demand space, time, freedom, but he didn't, because in the end, it wouldn't matter. The wheels had already been set in motion. The guest list was forming. The lawyers were drafting contracts. And he was the signature at the bottom of a page he hadn't written. He turned from the window now, setting the glass on the table with more force than necessary. The sound echoed, small and sharp. A photo lay beside it, printed, not digital, curiously out of step with the Monroe's otherwise modern approach. A woman stood in the corner of a garden, blurred in the distance. Dark hair, tied back, a dress with long sleeves, her face obscured by light and angle. Eleanor Reed. He didn't know her voice, didn't know how she walked, or laughed, or thought. She might as well have been an idea, a placeholder. But in 2 weeks, she would be his wife. He picked up the photo again, staring at the shapeless figure. What kind of person agreed to a marriage like this in silence? Someone desperate? Someone hiding? Someone like him? Outside, the rain tapped against the glass like fingers trying to remind him of something he'd forgotten. Caleb looked at the city, then back at the photo. "I don't even know your face," he said into the quiet. And the quiet, as always, said nothing back. The Reed estate sat on a stretch of land just outside Bend, Oregon. Not quite old money, not entirely new. It had the kind of quiet presence that whispered of wealth, but didn't flaunt it. Wide fields, stone walkways, tall windows with heavy curtains, and inside, an atmosphere dense with things unsaid. Caleb arrived by car just before sunset. The sky hung low with clouds, threatening snow. He stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, collar turned up against the wind. A staff member opened the door without a word and led him through the long entryway. The interior smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood. He was shown to a drawing room, with high ceilings and narrow sconces casting muted light. A fire crackled, more for sound than warmth. Eleanor was not there yet. Instead, her parents sat across from his. Daniel Reedleen, impeccably dressed, with eyes like winter glass rose to greet him. Beside him, Mrs. Reed offered a restrained smile, the kind that looked practiced. "I'm glad you made the trip," Mr. Reed said, gesturing to the armchair. "This is a family matter after all." Caleb sat, folding one leg over the other, scanning the room out of habit. There was a piano in the corner, closed. A painting of a woman on horseback above the fireplace. No personal photos. His mother cleared her throat. "She'll be down shortly." There was a pause, then the quiet sound of heels on hardwood. He turned. She entered the room with the same quietness that filled the house. A long, slate-colored dress, modestly cut, her dark hair pinned into a loose twist. But what struck him most was the thin, veil-soft gray silk that covered the lower half of her face, from the bridge of her nose to below her chin. Her eyes were striking, clear, intelligent, the kind that belonged to someone who saw more than they let on. She walked with unhurried steps and offered a gentle nod to the room. "Good evening. Eleanor, this is Caleb Monroe," her mother said. "Caleb, our daughter." He stood slowly. "Nice to finally meet you," he said, his voice neutral. She met his eyes. Likewise. They shook hands. Hers were cool, gloved, deliberate. Dinner followed in the formal dining hall, a long table set for 6, though only the immediate families were present. The meal was beautiful courses arranged like paintings, but Caleb barely touched his plate. His focus kept returning to her, to the veil, to how she never adjusted it, never explained it. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and low. She answered questions with thought, but offered nothing more. There was a kind of grace in how she navigated the evening, and yet it frustrated him. When the dishes were cleared and the parents excused themselves for coffee in the adjoining room, Caleb and Eleanor were left alone by the fireplace. He didn't wait long. "You always wear that?" he asked, tipping his head toward the veil. She turned her gaze to him, unreadable. "I do. No one thought to mention it. I didn't think it required permission." He blinked. "Right, of course." She looked back toward the fire. "I don't mean to be difficult." "I didn't say you were. But if we're going to be married, it's a bit strange not to see each other's faces, don't you think?" "Perhaps," she said, "but we're not married yet." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Is this some kind of condition?" She turned slightly toward him. "Do you see it that way?" "I don't know what to see. You're a mystery. I've read more about your family stock options than about you." A brief silence followed. Then, "Maybe that's part of the point." He narrowed his eyes. "What point?" "To see if you'd ask." There was something in her tone, neither defensive nor open, just a quiet challenge. Caleb studied her face, or what he could see of it. The veil moved slightly as she breathed. Her posture didn't change. She looked composed, untouched by the tension in his voice. "You don't make things easy," he said. "Would you rather I made them pleasant?" He exhaled. The fire cracked behind them. "I just want to know who I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life with." She didn't look away. "Then maybe we're not so different after all." The words hung there, delicate and sharp. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing dry leaves against the windows like a whisper. For the first time, Caleb wondered if the mystery he feared was not about her but about what she might uncover in him. The wedding was held in a stone chapel tucked away at the edge of the Washington countryside. The Monroe family chose the venue for its seclusion, its stained glass windows, and the absence of press. It was the kind of place where sound didn't echo, but disappeared into old wood and older silence. Outside, the sky was white with cloud, but no snow had fallen. Inside, the air was still. Guests murmured in polite tones, careful not to speak too loudly or with too much interest. The bride and groom had barely been seen in public. There were whispers, but no one dared say anything beyond the usual small talk. Caleb stood at the front of the chapel, hands clasped behind his back, jaw set. He wore black clean, formal, distant. The officiant cleared his throat beside him. The string quartet in the balcony began playing something quiet and indistinct. Then the doors opened. She appeared without announcement, without fanfare. Eleanor walked with measured grace, alone. No father on her arm, no attendants. She wore a pale ivory gown that trailed behind her like a sheet of snow, and the veil still there fell from a simple comb in her hair to her collarbones, obscuring everything but her eyes. Those eyes met his briefly, and in them Caleb saw not nerves or fear, but calm, the same calm that had unsettled him since the first moment they met. She took her place beside him. Neither of them smiled. The officiant began the service. Words were said about union, about shared paths, about patience and strength. Caleb repeated his vows, voice steady but distant. Eleanor did the same, without faltering. When the time came for the kiss, there was a pause. The officiant looked at them gently. "You may kiss the bride." Eleanor didn't move. She didn't reach for the veil. didn't gesture for permission. She simply waited. Caleb leaned forward, pressed his lips lightly against the sheer fabric covering her cheek, a symbolic gesture, hollow. Applause followed, soft and polite, but it felt like the closing of a door, not the beginning of something new. The reception was held at the Estadia warm room, filled with polished silverware, floating candles, and guests pretending to enjoy themselves. Caleb and Eleanor sat at the center table, surrounded but untouched. Conversation swirled around them like fog, vague and impersonal. He kept his hands on his glass, sipping but never tasting. Every so often, he glanced at her. She never removed the veil, not even to eat. She spoke with dignified economy. She answered when asked, never interrupted, never imposed. And still, they whispered. Across the hall, two women in designer dresses leaned toward one another. "She didn't even lift it for the kiss," one murmured. "Maybe she's hiding something," the other replied, glancing sideways. Caleb heard every word. The same question pulsed in his own chest. What was she keeping from him? A scar? A truth? Or something far more intangible, something he couldn't define? After hours of pleasantries and carefully orchestrated photo moments, the crowd thinned. The string quartet played one last song. The staff moved quietly to gather plates and extinguish candles. Caleb and Eleanor were escorted upstairs to the private wing prepared for them. Inside the suite, the fireplace was lit, casting golden shadows across the room. Eleanor removed her gloves and set them neatly on the vanity. She didn't speak. Caleb finally broke the silence. "Are you ever going to take it off?" She turned, folding her hands before her. "Not tonight." He laughed once, low and sharp. "Is that the rhythm now? One-sided mystery, daily rituals, and occasional small talk?" Eleanor didn't respond. He stepped closer. "Do you even care what people said today? What they're thinking about you? About us?" She met his gaze. "Why would their assumptions matter more than your own?" He didn't answer, because she was right. There was a long pause, the only sound the pop of wood in the fire. "I just want to know who I married," he said finally, quieter now. "You will," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "In time." He looked at her for a moment longer, then walked to the bar in the corner, poured himself a drink, and took the chair by the fire, his suit still on, his tie still tight. She returned to the vanity, undid the pins in her hair, and let it fall loose. The silk veil remained. They fell into silencenat, uncomfortable, not warm, just present. Two figures in a room, bound by paper and promise, yet still strangers. Outside, the wind began to rise. And in the faint rustle of the curtains, something shifted. Not quite connection, but the beginning of a question neither of them had asked aloud. The days that followed blurred into a routine shaped more by avoidance than affection. Caleb left early most mornings, his schedule packed with meetings, site inspections, and dinners with people he barely tolerated. He returned late, often when the lights in the apartment were already dimmed. He assumed she kept to her own hours, perhaps intentionally. They crossed paths in doorways and shared the occasional breakfast, always formal, always brief. She never took off the veil, but she also never tried to defend it again. It should have been easy to ignore her presence. She did not intrude, did not demand, and yet she was everywhere. The house had changed. Books appeared on the coffee table Caleb didn't recognize but eventually opened. A volume of essays on architecture and silence. A memoir by a woman who'd once walked across Greenland alone. Poetry without titles. Once, he came home to find a kettle warming on the stove and a note in her handwriting. For cold hands, not the worst thing to fix. Another night, after a particularly tense board meeting, he found a legal folder on his desk with 3 bullet points scrawled inside. She had reviewed one of the pending contracts quietly, thoroughly, and highlighted a liability clause no one on his team had caught. No message, no praise. Just facts. Precision. He began to pay closer attention. One morning, he stood outside the kitchen, hidden from view, listening. Inside, Eleanor's voice floated through the half-open door. She was speaking with Rosa, the housekeeper. Her tone was gentle, measured, the way one might speak to an old friend or a bird perched nervously on a windowsill. "You don't have to rush," she said. "Let the bread rest. It will open on its own if you let it." Rosa chuckled. "You sound like my grandmother." Maybe she was right. There was laughter, not the loud, effortless kind, but something warmer, a release, the kind Caleb hadn't heard in a long time. Another time, he caught a glimpse of her through the study window, out in the garden in the early dusk. She wore a shawl and gloves, crouched next to a pot of withering herbs. Her hands moved slowly, checking the roots. Her breath made soft clouds in the cold air. He hadn't realized they kept rosemary. He found himself observing her movements, not with suspicion, but with quiet interest. How she placed things, how she folded napkins without looking, how she carried stillness with her, not as absence, but as choice. One evening, as he walked down the hall toward his office, he heard music coming from behind a door that was usually shut. The piano. The notes were hesitant at first, then steadier minor keys, long pauses between chords. Someone was remembering or relearning. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he leaned against the wall just outside the door, eyes closed, letting the sounds settle around him. It wasn't polished. It wasn't performance. It was her. The next morning, she joined him for coffee. Not planned, not announced. She simply walked in, took the seat across from him, and said, "You should put more cinnamon in this. It's meant to be warm, not bitter." He looked at her, startled. She poured a little into his mug from the small spice jar on the table, stirred it gently. He took a sip. She was right. They didn't say much after that, but something had shifted. The silence between them no longer felt like distance. It began to feel like space. It was nearly midnight when Caleb found her in the library. The fire was low, casting long orange shadows across the shelves. Rain tapped against the tall windows like a persistent thought refusing to fade. She was seated in the same leather chair she always preferred, legs tucked beneath her, a book open in her lap. She didn't look up when he entered, but she didn't pretend not to notice him either. Her stillness acknowledged him. He remained standing for a moment, one hand on the back of a nearby chair, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't angry, or at least, not just angry. It was something heavier than that, something he hadn't been able to name. "I need to ask you something," he said. She closed her book and placed it carefully on the table beside her. "All right." He hesitated. The room felt too quiet. He moved to stand closer, near the edge of the light. His voice was controlled, but something inside it trembled. "Why do you keep it on?" Her eyes met his, calm, unshaken. "Because I'm not ready to take it off." He exhaled, slow and tight. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give." He began to pace, short steps across the rug. "People think you're hiding something. They say it behind your back, but it's there, always there. And two don't even know how to defend you. I don't even know if I should. You're not required to defend me. But I'm married to you." "Yes." "And I don't know you," he snapped, turning to face her. She remained in her chair, back straight, hands folded. "That's not entirely my fault." The words landed harder than he expected. "I've tried," he said, his voice lower now. "In my way. I've been patient. I've given space. I've even stopped asking questions. But you're not just silent, Eleanor. You're distant. You hold yourself apart like you're waiting for me to fail some test." She stood then, slow and deliberate, her silhouette tall against the firelight. "This isn't a test," she said. "Then what is it?" She walked toward the window, pulled aside the curtain, and looked out into the darkness. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass, layered with the night beyond. "I wore the veil because it was easier," she said finally. "Easier than being judged for things I couldn't control. Easier than being seen before I had the chance to be understood." He watched her in silence. "I've spent most of my life being mistaken for someone I'm not," she continued. Quiet meant weak. Cautious meant secretive. And in this marriage, I didn't want to start as someone explained to others by rumor. He spoke softly. So you chose to disappear. She turned back to him. Her voice was steady. No, I chose to wait. For what? For you. To ask, not just to see. He swallowed hard. And have I asked? She nodded, slowly. Tonight. For the first time. Something in his chest shifted. Something old and rigid. I've been afraid, he admitted. She didn't respond, but her posture softened. I thought you were hiding something I couldn't handle, he continued. A scar, a flaw, a truth I wasn't ready for. But now I think I was just afraid you might be more than I expected, and I wouldn't know what to do with that. Her voice was quiet. You don't have to do anything. He stepped closer. Then why does it feel like everything depends on it? She looked up at him. Her eyes, no longer distant, were filled with something else now. Not sorrow, not resistance. Hope, perhaps, or forgiveness. Because knowing someone takes time, she said, and time only matters when both people stay. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask again. Instead, he sat in the armchair across from hers, the firelight between them, and let the silence return not as a wall, but as a place to rest. After that night, nothing changed at once. The veil remained, the silence remained, but the way they looked at each other did not. It was small things at first. Eleanor began joining Caleb for breakfast not every morning, but often enough for it to become a quiet routine. She brought her own tea, always steeped longer than necessary. He started leaving a second spoon beside the sugar bowl, without thinking. She asked about his work not out of politeness, but with interest. He had expected questions about numbers, reports, percentages. Instead, she asked about the people involved, what they feared, what they stood to lose. He found himself explaining things in ways he hadn't before, slower, clearer, and she listened, really listened with the kind of stillness that made him want to keep speaking. One afternoon, he invited her to sit in on a meeting with a development partner. He didn't introduce her with title or explanation, just gave her a seat at the table. She said little, took notes, watched the room. Afterward, she pointed out a phrase in the proposal language that, if left unchanged, would have created long-term risk. You don't need to change the contract, she said. Just clarify intent. That's what they're worried about. They don't think you'll keep your word when the details get blurred. He nodded, then paused. How did you see that? She shrugged. Because it's the only part that made me uneasy. The adjustment worked. The deal moved forward. No one gave her credit. But Caleb remembered. He began to bring her drafts of things, not out of obligation, but curiosity. And she read them, always. They started walking together in the evenings, when the halls were empty and the night had settled over the city. Sometimes they talked about meaningless things, childhood books, street names that sounded wrong, songs they only remembered half of. Other times they said nothing, letting the sounds of traffic and the wind between buildings speak for them. In the privacy of those walks, Caleb asked questions he would never have dared in daylight. What were you like before all this? Eleanor had smiled beneath the veil. Quieter. He laughed, surprised. That's possible. I think I was hiding from more than just the world back then. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. One night, she left a book on his desk. No note, no explanation. Inside, a sentence was underlined in pencil. We fear being seen, not because we are ashamed, but because we long to be known without armor. He read it 3 times. He placed it on her side of the table the next morning. The following week, she returned it with another page marked, and so it went. Their conversations, though few, deepened. Their silences, once cold, became gentle. Neither of them declared anything, but something between them had begun to soften like frost receding at the edges of glass. One evening, as they sat beside the fireplace again, 2 months after their wedding, Caleb turned to her, voice quiet. You could have left this marriage just as easily as I could have. She didn't respond right away. Then, I didn't want to. He studied her. Why not? Eleanor looked toward the fire, the flames catching in her eyes. "Because I saw something in you," she said, "even when you didn't see it yourself." Caleb felt something close around his chestnut pain. Exactly, but something old and unfamiliar, a longing he hadn't given himself permission to name. "I was angry," he admitted. "I know. I didn't want to need anyone. I know that too." He looked at her then, for a long moment. "I'm trying," she nodded. "So am I." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a promise. But it was more than either of them had said before. The gala was held in late spring, just as the trees in the Monroe courtyard began to bloom. It was a celebration not of a marriage or a family name, but of a major merger Eleanor had helped negotiate behind the scenes. Quietly, thoroughly, precisely, as always. Caleb had insisted on honoring it. "People deserve to know what you've done," he told her. "I'm not sure they'll care," she replied. "I do." She didn't answer, but she agreed to attend. The evening unfolded in warm light and soft jazz. The room was filled with polished guests, crystal glasses, and practiced conversations. Caleb moved among them with a grace he hadn't possessed months earlier, shaking hands and speaking thoughtfully. But every few minutes, he glanced toward the grand staircase. She hadn't come down yet. People began to notice. "Your wife isn't joining us tonight?" a board member asked, careful not to sound intrusive. "She will," Caleb replied, quietly certain, though part of him wasn't sure. Then the music faltered. The crowd turned. At the top of the staircase, Eleanor appeared. No veil, no shadow. Just a woman in a deep emerald gown, her shoulders bare, her hair pinned back with small silver clips. Her face, no longer hidden, carried no trace of apology. Her expression was still composed. But her eyes, those same gray eyes, shelled something new. They met his from across the room. He stood frozen as she began her descent. The guests moved aside, drawn to her presence not with awe, but something gentler. Recognition. A kind of quiet respect. When she reached him, Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. She turned to face the room. The music paused. "I imagine some of you wondered why I spent so much of the past few months behind a veil," she began, her voice clear, steady. No microphone, no platform, just the truth, spoken plainly. Some may have thought I was hiding something unpleasant, others something fragile. But the truth is simpler than that. She looked at Caleb, then back to the crowd. "I wore the veil because I wanted space. Space to be heard before being seen. I've spent much of my life being defined by appearances, assumptions, and silence. And I wanted this marriage, this moment, to begin not with surface, but with substance." There was no applause, only stillness, a breath held by a room. She turned back to him. "I took it off because you earned it, not with demands, but with patience. Not by asking what I looked like, but by showing me who you were." Caleb stepped forward, his voice low. "I was afraid I'd fall in love with someone I couldn't see, but the truth is, I already had." She smiled, small, real, and I fell in love with the man who stopped looking and started noticing. He took her hand, and she didn't let go. That night, they danced slowly, long after most guests had gone. Not for show, not for ritual, just because the music was soft, and the night was theirs. Later, on the quiet balcony above the city, Eleanor leaned into his shoulder. "You know," she said, "this could have ended very differently." "I know. You could have walked away. So could you." They both looked at the skyline, where the lights pulsed gently in the dark. He whispered, "I'm glad we stayed." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hand in his said enough. And for the first time since they met, there was no veil between them, no distance left to cross, just the quiet, shared, not as absence but as peace.